my name's Marin. And my brother didn't just steal from me. He rewrote me out of my own family. I found my parents sitting at the airport like strangers, clutching each other, shivering. And when they looked up, they said, "He told us not to see you anymore." That wasn't heartbreak. That was strategy. And if you think this is just another family drama, you haven't met Asher. They say silence keeps the peace. But what if your silence was the very thing he used to erase you? Before we dive in, what time are you listening? And where? Drop a comment. Because this story, it could happen anywhere. It was barely sunrise when I reached Denver International Airport. The air outside bit through my coat, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache before you've even taken a full breath. I'd driven the entire night after getting that call, the one that said my parents had been found wandering near Gate C3, confused, waiting for a flight that didn't exist. Inside, the terminal smelled of coffee and disinfectant. The loudspeaker repeated flight numbers in that calm, emotionless voice that somehow made everything feel lonelier. I scanned the rows of seats near the gate until I saw them. My mother was sitting with her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking as if he'd been carved from worry itself. Their coats were too thin for the season, their suitcases too small for travel. It hit me all at once. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had sent them here to make a point. For a moment, I stood there just watching. The world moved around them. Boarding calls, rolling suitcases, children crying, yet they looked frozen in time. When I finally stepped closer, my boots echoed against the tile. My mother turned her head slowly, as if the sound pulled her from a faraway place. "Mom," I said softly, kneeling down beside her. "What happened? Why are you here?" Her eyes flickered, and then came the words that would rearrange everything I thought I knew. "Your brother said you didn't want us around anymore." I thought I'd misheard her. "He said what?" "He told us," my father added, his voice trembling, "that you'd changed, that you didn't want to be bothered with family anymore." My stomach tightened. The sterile air around us felt heavier. Asher, my brother, had always been clever with words. He knew how to twist a story just enough to make it believable. But this was something else. "Dad, that's not true," I whispered. "I never said that." They didn't look convinced. Not really. It wasn't anger in their faces. It was doubt. Doubt planted deep enough to take root. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the embroidered handkerchief I'd given my mother last Christmas. White linen with tiny blue initials, MV. I offered it to her, like I always did when she cried. She pushed it, back toward me, shaking her head. "Keep it. You'll need it more." Her words hit harder than a slap. I froze, trying to breathe through the sting. I managed a nod and stood, the sound of rolling suitcases rushing past us like a current I couldn't fight. My mother adjusted her scarf. My father looked away, and I understood what had been done. Not confusion, not miscommunication, but isolation, deliberate and precise. The world I'd kept under control, my career, my sanity, my carefully balanced peace, cracked like glass. I walked out of the terminal without looking back. The air outside was colder now, and the parking lot was half empty. I leaned against the car door and dialed his number. It rang once before he picked up. "I was wondering when you'd call," Asher said, his tone light, casual, infuriating. "What did you tell them?" I asked. My voice barely carried. "I told them the truth," he said. "You've always been difficult, Marin. This family's tired of walking on eggshells around you." I bit down the words rising in my throat. "You're lying, and you know it." He sighed. "You've had control long enough. Dad trusts me now. I'm just setting things right." There it was. The real reason. Power. the oldest addiction in our family. I swallowed the bitterness and said quietly, I hope you enjoy that sense of power, because it's the only thing you'll have left when I'm done. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, a promise. Then the line went dead. I stood there for a while, watching the exhaust from taxis drift like ghosts across the lot. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Something inside me had shifted, a boundary, a belief, maybe both. When I finally went back inside, I found my parents gone. Just the empty bench near gate C3, a crumpled boarding pass on the floor, and that handkerchief lying where my mother had dropped it. I picked it up carefully, the fabric still warm from her hands. For the first time, I didn't feel small or powerless. I just felt awake, wide awake in a world that had been playing me like a fool. There are messages that break you, I murmured. And then there are messages that build the fire you never knew you had. I folded the handkerchief, slipped it into my coat pocket, and whispered, You'll need it more. I stood in my kitchen, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea, staring at the text that had just come in. It'll be good to see you again. Don't start anything. It was from Mom, no emojis, no heart. Just a fragile peace offering wrapped in warning tape. The kind of message you only send when you're afraid things might get loud. 2 weeks had passed since the airport. 2 weeks of unanswered questions and quiet unraveling. I hadn't spoken to Asher since that phone call. I hadn't even told anyone at work what happened. I functioned on autopilot. Wake, work, sleep, repeat. But today was different. Asher had invited me to dinner. He said it was time to clear the air, that family needed to come together. I should have deleted the invite on sight, but something in me, a stupid flicker of hope, or maybe just emotional exhaustion, made me say yes. I told myself I wanted clarity, closure. But if I was being honest, I think I wanted to see their faces when I walked through the door. I wanted proof that I still belonged, or confirmation that I didn't. By the time I parked outside Asher's home, dusk had settled in. His house sat like a showroom piece in the middle of the cul-de-sac. Every hedge trimmed, every light timed. No chipped paint, no rust, just silence behind designer windows. I adjusted my coat, fixed my scarf, and walked up the drive. I rang the bell. The door opened, and there he was, smug, smiling, holding a glass of something amber in one hand like we were old friends reuniting for Thanksgiving. Look who actually showed up, he said. I didn't smile. You invited me. He stepped aside. And yet, part of me didn't think you'd come. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary and slow-cooked lamb. I followed the scent toward the dining room, heels quiet on the hardwood. The table was already set. White linens, gold trim plates, candlesticks, 7 chairs around a long mahogany table, but none for me. I stopped, looked again, maybe I'd miscounted, but no. 6 seats were taken, 1 was empty, and not one was at the head. Asher noticed. Oh, he said with a half laugh. We weren't sure if you were coming. Thought we'd play it safe. He gestured toward a chair leaning near the kitchen, not even part of the set. Something out of a breakfast nook, thin-legged and mismatched. His wife Gina slid it next to the kitchen entrance, close enough to smell the dishwasher, far enough from the center to feel like a guest at her own wake. I sat without a word. My face was calm, but my chest felt tight, like being wrapped in wool on a hot day. Suffocating, but if you complained, you'd look dramatic. The meal began with the usual surface-level chatter. Weather, work. A few polite nods from cousins who hadn't texted me in years. Then Asher cleared his throat and pulled out a thick folder. I wanted to share something special, he said. The new branch just launched last week. Took a lot of late nights, but we made it. He passed around glossy papers, photos of buildings, blueprints, project timelines. Legacy Construction's expanding, he beamed, just like Dad dreamed. My fingers curled under the table. Legacy Construction. The company Dad and I built with nothing but grit and a borrowed truck. The summers I gave up, the weekends, the late nights in cold trailers, sketching out drywall placements and cost estimates while Mom was in chemo. And now Asher was presenting it like a science fair project. I didn't speak. I just listened and listened and listened. Each sentence landed like a slap. "We're proud of the new direction," Gina said. Asher really stepped up. Mom, seated across from me, smiled faintly. "He's made a lot of sacrifices." And I said it before I even realized it was coming out of my mouth. "He didn't make sacrifices," I said quietly. "He made transfers. From my account." The room froze. Forks stilled midair. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Asher's smile faltered for just a second, but that was enough. "I think I'm done," I said, reaching for my coat. "Marin," Mom started, but I was already standing. "Dinner's over, for me, at least." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I just walked out, the sound of my boots echoing down the hallway like punctuation. Outside, the night air wrapped around me, cooler than expected, sharper. I took a breath, then another. My hand instinctively went to my coat pocket. The handkerchief was still there, soft, familiar. "They built walls with politeness," I whispered, "and called it family." I turned back once, just for a second. Through the front window, I saw the glow of laughter reignite. Someone refilled a glass. Plates passed hands. The seat I left behind was already gone, and so was the illusion that this family still had room for me. That night, I drove home in silence. The city lights passed in a blur, orange, white, and hollow. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just kept replaying the look on Asher's face when I stood up from that table. How calm he looked, like he'd been waiting for that exact moment. By the time I got home, it was close to midnight. My apartment felt colder than usual, the kind of quiet that made every sound too loud. I tossed my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and dropped into the chair by my small desk. The only light came from my laptop screen. I wasn't planning to check emails. I just needed something to do, something that didn't involve thinking about what had just happened. I clicked through junk mail, client updates, and digital receipts until one subject line stopped me. Transfer of ownership, Vale Construction Holdings. The message was forwarded accidentally. It said, FWD, review before submission. The sender was Asher's assistant, someone I barely knew, but had met a few times during company meetings. I hovered my cursor over the attachment. My stomach twisted. I almost closed the window, but I didn't. The PDF loaded slowly, line by line, until the header came into view. Official letterhead, the company logo, legal formatting. It looked legitimate, too legitimate. My name appeared halfway down the page, and then I saw it. My father's company, the business I'd helped him build from the ground up, listed under sole ownership, Asher Vale. I scrolled further. There it was again, my name next to a signature. My signature. Only, it wasn't. It looked close. Same loops, same slant, but it wasn't mine. It was practiced, copied. My throat went dry. My hands hovered over the keyboard, shaking. The date on the form read May 3rd, 3 months before Dad passed. That was impossible, except it wasn't. A memory came rushing back so vividly it almost knocked the air out of me. 3 years earlier, in my father's hospital room. The beeping machines, the faint scent of antiseptic, the sound of my brother's voice saying, "It's just a formality, Marin. Some tax paperwork for Dad's holdings. Nothing serious." I'd signed something that day. I remembered the pen, his reassuring smile, the way he'd kept talking about family and trust, distracting me from the fine print. Dad had been sleeping, frail and hooked to oxygen. I didn't even read the document. He'd used that moment, my weakest, my most distracted moment, to erase me. I sat back in my chair, the laptop screen burning my eyes. I scrolled again, slower this time. Every line confirmed it. I'd been written out of my father's legacy. I whispered to the empty room, he didn't just erase me. He used my hands to do it. The words hung in the air, raw and ugly. Sleep wasn't even an option after that. I spent the rest of the night pacing, replaying every interaction, every text, every dinner, every smile that suddenly didn't look so brotherly anymore. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I called him. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy but smug. "Marin, you're up early." "I saw the documents," I said flatly. Pause. Then, so you finally understand. "You forged my signature." He laughed, the sound hollow through the receiver. "You always were careless with paperwork. Maybe check your files before accusing people." "You forged it," I said again, slower this time, letting each word cut. He sighed, that same fake patience he used on clients and teachers when we were kids. "You can believe whatever helps you sleep, but if you're thinking of doing something stupid, like calling a lawyer, you might want to remember who Dad trusted to handle the estate." "You mean the estate you stole?" "Try proving it," he said, and hung up. I stared at the phone. The silence afterward was worse than shouting. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I had to sit down. My heart was hammering so loud it drowned out the world. I walked to the corner of the room where my father's old drafting table sat. It was scratched and sun-faded, but still solid, the only piece of him I'd managed to keep. I brushed a layer of dust from the surface, revealing the faint pencil marks of his handwriting. His sketches were still there, clean lines, precise notes, initials in the margins. Every line he drew had purpose. Every word Asher said was built on taking. I traced one of the blueprints with my fingertip. The paper had yellowed with time, but the ink was still strong. My initials, MV, stood right there in the corner beside Dad's. I felt a calm start to settle in. Not peace, not yet, but focus. I went back to my desk, opened the printer tray, and printed the document from the email. The hum of the machine filled the room. Each page slid out like another piece of evidence falling into place. When it finished, I gathered the papers, aligned the edges, and slipped them into an envelope. On the front, in bold letters, I wrote one word: proof. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the handkerchief. I laid it flat under the envelope. For a second, I just stared at them. The fabric soft and worn, the envelope sharp and new. The past and the present side by side. "He made it legal," I whispered, "but I'll make it right." I tucked the envelope into a drawer, closed it carefully, and turned off the lights. My reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar. Older, harder, sharper. Every thief leaves a trail, I thought. Even if it's written in ink you can't see yet. I rarely slept in that apartment anymore. After discovering the documents, the silence in my mind had turned into static. So when I stepped into the lobby of Vale Construction's headquarters in the afternoon light, I was paying attention. Every detail, every polished floor tile, every monitor flicker felt like a witness. I pressed the elevator button and watched my reflection morph in the brushed steel door. The same face, sharper eyes, a steady jaw. I reminded myself of that. My name was still Marin Vale. My father's company had my DNA in every beam and contract. But today, the nameplate was gone. When I signed in at the front desk, the receptionist looked at me with thin politeness. She tapped the screen. "You're not listed on the visitor system, Ms. Vale." Her tone carried the weight of borrower rather than daughter. I took a breath. "Then I guess I'm unexpected," I said and smiled. None of my family would ever call me that. Unexpected? But maybe that was the point. The elevator climbed slowly to the 9th floor. My footsteps echoed down the corridor where I once walked with Dad, planning deals and sketching ideas. I found the archive room and knocked lightly. The assistant looked up. "I'm here to review some old tax files," I said, voice calm. "Dad's side of the estate, just routine." She nodded, slightly uneasy, and let me in. Inside that room, I began to dig, folders stacked, file after file. My eyes landing on names I'd known, my own, many times over, but they had shifted. I pulled a folder marked Vale Construction Holdings Transfers 2019. I flipped through pages until I reached a signature block. Familiar Loops, MV, signed May 3rd, 3 months before Dad died. It wasn't mine. A cold realization crept up my spine. This was systematic. It wasn't just a one-off change. It was an erasure, planned, executed, and hidden. I shut the folder with a soft snap. Later, as I left that office, I spotted David Klein. He used to look at me like I belonged. Today, domain of his expression had changed. Soft, guarded. He waited by the stairwell. "Asher's setting up a trust in his name only," he murmured. "If you push this, he'll bury you." He slipped something into my hand, a USB drive, without meeting my eyes. This never existed. Then he was gone. I stood still. The hush of the building felt oppressive. I turned the drive over in my palm. The weight of it said more than words. A quiet alliance, a truth offered in silence. At home that night, the memory of Dad came back. I sat at my drafting table, wood-worn, blueprints half-rolled, his pencil still there. I remembered him whispering during chemo, "If Asher takes over, you keep him honest." I'd nodded then, weak and afraid. I didn't know what it meant. Now I did. I stared at a framed photo of us, me and him. But I noticed the crop. My half of the picture was behind glass, folded. Asher's face front and center. He had been rewriting history long before the paperwork. The next morning, I noticed the corner of my desk still held that handkerchief I carried since that first day at the airport. I used it now to wipe the dust off Dad's table. A simple gesture, but it felt like reclaiming space. My mind repeated the truth. He's not the only one who knows how to build something from the ground up. The difference is, mine won't collapse on lies. In the quiet, I opened my laptop. I attached the files from the USB drive to an email addressed to my lawyer friend. Subject, for safekeeping. That's all I wrote. Then I hit send. When you live long enough in silence, you start hearing what people say when they think you're gone. And that's what had been happening to me for years. I just never realized it. It was early morning, and the light creeping through my kitchen blinds was too bright for someone who hadn't slept. I sat at the table, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My phone buzzed once, a voicemail notification blinking. I pressed play, already bracing for the voice I knew too well. "Marin," my mother said, her tone clipped, distant. "Asher says you're causing trouble again. Why can't you just move on?" The message ended with a soft exhale, a sound that used to mean love, but now just meant resignation. I let the silence stretch before whispering to the empty room, "Because he never lets me." It wasn't until that moment that the truth landed. My silence hadn't been peace. It had been permission. I'd given him the quiet he needed to rewrite the story, to paint me as the unstable one, the overreactor. And now the paint had dried. I grabbed my coat and keys, left the coffee untouched, and drove toward the city. I didn't have a destination at first, just the need to be somewhere that didn't echo with old ghosts. I ended up at a cafe I hadn't been to in years, a small brick place downtown where my father used to stop after client meetings. Inside, the air smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon. The place hadn't changed. Same creaky floors, same faded photos of construction crews on the wall. I took a booth in the corner, near the window, and waited for the woman who had agreed to meet me, Evelyn. She'd been my father's assistant for almost a decade. She taught me how to fill out my first work order, how to keep invoices organized. After he died, she disappeared from the company almost overnight. When she arrived, she looked older but alert, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. She slid into the booth without a word. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," she said softly. "I didn't think you would agree," I replied. She gave a faint smile, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photograph. "I kept this," she said, passing it across the table. "Your father had it framed on his desk for years, but after he passed, Asher replaced it." I opened the photo carefully. It was of Dad and me at the old construction site, the first office we ever built. The back was scribbled with ink, for MV. That inscription had been cropped out of every version of the photo I'd seen at the company. I turned the picture over again, feeling a lump form in my throat. "He rewrote even our pictures," I murmured. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I saw him switch out the files before your father's will was finalized," she confessed. "I should have said something then, but Asher made sure everyone believed you'd walked away. He's good at making people doubt their own memory." She hesitated, then added, "Check the photo's file data. The edit's traceable. It's not much, but it's proof something's been changed." I wanted to thank her, but the words caught in my throat. It felt like gratitude and grief tangled together. By the time I left the cafe, the clouds were low, pressing against the tops of the buildings. I reached my car, checked my phone again. Another email. Notice of non-renewal. Residential lease. My lease was ending in 30 days. No explanation. Just a name at the bottom. Property manager, Vale Realty. Of course. He'd found another way to close in. I drove home without thinking, parked, and sat in the car long after the engine stopped. I watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. My apartment windows glowed faintly from across the lot. Everything inside, my father's blueprints, his drafting tools, the envelope marked proof, looked small and temporary. "Maybe he wins because he doesn't feel guilt," I whispered. "I'm still trying to be the better one." I didn't know whether that made me noble or naive. Later that afternoon, I started boxing up my things. One by one, I packed reminders of what used to matter. The framed photo, the old handkerchief, the letters my father wrote from job sites. The sound of tape tearing off the roll filled the silence like static. When I stepped outside to toss the first box in the car, a voice startled me. A woman sat by the sidewalk near the cafe's dumpster, older, wrapped in layers of clothing. She looked up and said, almost to herself, "Quiet ones always see the end before the rest." Her eyes met mine for a moment, steady and clear. I didn't answer, but something in her tone hit a nerve, like an echo of my father's voice the week before he died. "You always notice before they do, kiddo. That's your curse and your strength." I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the eviction notice, and tore it cleanly down the middle. Then again, then again. The pieces fluttered into the trash can. "No more polite exits," I said. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, staring at David Klein's number. It took me 3 tries to hit call. He picked up quickly, voice low. "Marin?" "I'm not backing down," I said. "Tell me when the next board meeting is." A pause. "Marin, that's dangerous. You don't know what Asher's—" "I know exactly what he's doing, and I'm done pretending not to." He exhaled hard through the line. "You're forcing his hand." "Good," I said. "It's time he showed it." I ended the call before he could answer. My pulse was steady. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I unfolded the handkerchief one last time and wrapped it around my father's photo, the inscription pressed against the fabric. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a vow. I stopped asking what I'd lost, whispered to the quiet room, and started asking what he feared I might still find. The morning of the board meeting, I stood in front of the mirror, tying my hair back into a low knot. No makeup, no jewelry, just a plain gray suit and a steady gaze. I didn't want to look powerful. I wanted to look like the woman everyone underestimated. The drive to Vale Construction felt shorter than it had in years. Maybe because I wasn't heading there as someone begging to be heard. I was going there to speak, loudly, if needed. The boardroom hadn't changed. Still that sterile mix of glass and chrome, the kind of design meant to impress without revealing anything. I stepped in 15 minutes early. The receptionist barely looked up until I approached the desk. "You're not listed on the meeting system, Ms. Vale," she said, tight-lipped. I leaned in, lowered my voice just enough to force her attention. "That's the beauty of showing up anyway." She blinked, unsure whether to stop me or let me pass. I didn't wait for permission. My heels echoed on the floor as I walked through the corridor and opened the glass door to the room where it all began, and where today something would end. A few board members looked up, confused. Some smiled politely, others whispered to each other like I was a rumor come to life. Then Asher walked in. Tailored navy suit, polished shoes, that same effortless smirk he wore like armor. He stopped short when he saw me, just for a second, but it was enough. His eyes darted to the empty chair at the far end of the table. He said nothing, just gestured for the meeting to begin. "Thank you all for being here," he said smoothly. "I want to share our new development blueprint, one that will redefine the next decade for Vale Construction." He clicked a remote, and the screen lit up behind him. I already knew what was coming. I'd spent 2 years drafting the foundations of that project. Every square inch had been my vision. Now it was branded under his name, reworked just enough to claim authorship, but not enough to hide the fingerprints I left behind. I waited until he finished his rehearsed pitch. Then I quietly placed a folder on the table. "Before you move to a vote," I said, "there's something you should see." The room quieted. I opened the folder, revealing my original blueprints. Dated, signed, annotated in my handwriting, initials marked clearly. MV. The timestamp predated every version Asher had just shown. "Those were never approved," he snapped, but his voice faltered. "That was preliminary work." I looked him straight in the eye. "Preliminary doesn't mean non-existent. You rebranded my work. Again." One of the board members leaned in to inspect the plans. Another reached for their phone. The energy shifted. "You always loved drama, didn't you?" Asher said, voice rising. I didn't blink. "No, just truth. But I see how you get them confused." His smirk vanished. For a moment, I saw the real Asher, cornered, bitter, desperate. But he wasn't finished. He pulled out his own folder, thick and pristine, and dropped it beside mine. "These," he said loudly, "are the signed transfer documents. Years old, legal, binding. Her signature's right there. She gave it all up." Murmurs rose again. He looked around, feeding on their doubt. Then I reached into my blazer and pulled out a small flash drive. "This," I said calmly, "is the backup system you forgot to wipe when you took over the servers." I plugged it into the screen at the front of the room. The files opened one by one, timestamps, access logs, the original contracts. Then, the kicker, login records traced directly to Asher's account, editing timestamps weeks after our father's death. Nobody spoke. He stood frozen, his jaw twitching. "You'll regret this," he muttered, voice barely audible. "I already did," I said. He grabbed his things and walked out, not even trying to spin it. The silence he left behind was louder than anything he could have said. One of the board members finally cleared her throat. "We'll need to review all of this." she said carefully. I nodded. I'll send the files. And I'm not here for the title. I'm here for the truth. I gathered my documents, slid the flash drive back into my pocket, and left the room without looking back. The late afternoon sun had dipped low by the time I reached the parking lot. The heat was dry, the wind soft. I sat in my car, engine off, and let the quiet wrap around me. For the first time in months, I felt something unrecognizable. Relief. Not joy, not victory. Just the release of breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I reached into my purse and pulled out my father's old handkerchief. This time, I didn't use it to clean a desk or cover a photo. I pressed it gently to the corner of my eye. Build something that lasts longer than anger, he'd once told me. I looked up at the sky, whispered, I'm trying, Dad. And for a second, I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder, steady, warm, proud. But the warmth didn't last. 2 days later, the air in my apartment was thick with something else. Anticipation and dread mixed into one. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. I sat at my desk, laptop open, scrolling through a string of cautious messages from board members. Impressive presentation, Marin. You handled yourself well. We'll need to review everything internally. All polite, all hollow. People love justice until it costs them dinner invitations. I folded my father's handkerchief and placed it neatly on the edge of the desk. I used to do that to remind myself of loss. Now it meant protection, something solid between me and the chaos waiting outside. My phone buzzed, screen flashing private number. I didn't hesitate. Asher, you really think anyone believes you? His tone was calm, almost amused. Watch what happens next. Click. I stared at the screen for a long second, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. I knew him well enough to believe the threat wasn't empty. By morning, I saw what he meant. The first headline appeared before breakfast. Estranged sister tries to blackmail family business. By noon, another, unstable former employee leaks confidential files. And then the anonymous emails, accusations of embezzlement, theft, misconduct, all so ridiculous I might have laughed if they weren't so effective. People didn't care whether it was true, they just liked the story. By evening, my landlord called. Ms. Vale, I've received complaints, noise, unreported visitors, late payments. I'm afraid. I cut him off. You're being paid to read a script, aren't you? A pause. Then quietly, I'm sorry, Ms. Vale. I hung up, jaw tight. Every move Asher made was precise, each one aimed to isolate me further. The next call came from my lawyer friend, Karen. Her voice trembled. Marin, he's filed an injunction against you. He's claiming you stole company data. I felt my pulse slow, not speed up. He's escalating because he's cornered. Marin, this could get ugly. It already is. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, focused. He wanted me rattled. Instead, I felt steady. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. Maybe I shouldn't have, but some part of me still believed my mother would open the door and see the truth. When she did open it, she didn't. She kept the chain on, just enough for her eyes to meet mine through the narrow space. You're tearing this family apart, she said quietly. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, softly, he already did. I'm just holding up the mirror. She flinched like I'd slapped her. Asher's trying to keep this family together. By lying? By protecting what's left, she whispered. Then the door closed. The sound of the lock clicking was sharper than anything Asher had ever said to me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, before walking back to my car. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it always had been. That night, I opened the USB David had given me weeks earlier. I'd gone through most of its contents already, but one folder had remained untouched. Backup, transfer. Inside was a video file. I clicked play. Asher's voice filled the room. Yeah, I had her sign it while Dad was in the hospital. She was too emotional to notice. Easiest thing I ever pulled off. I froze. My reflection stared back at me from the laptop screen, pale, motionless. Then I laughed, just once, sharp and bitter. Got you, I whispered. I forwarded the video to Karen with a short message. If I disappear, this goes public. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the tears fall. Not from sadness this time, but relief. The kind that comes from finally having proof, not hope. 2 days later, I packed my bag and drove toward the airport. The same one where everything began. My parents were flying back from visiting relatives in Oregon, and I needed to see them face to face. No headlines, no phone calls, no half-truths between us. The highway stretched ahead, flat and empty. The kind of quiet that makes you think too much. Sometimes you have to let the storm hit so the dust can finally settle. When I reached the terminal, I parked near the same entrance, Gate C3. Funny how certain places never let you go. Inside, the intercom echoed flight numbers and arrivals. I found a seat near the window, folded my hands, and waited. Every few seconds, I checked the arrivals board. My stomach tightened with each passing minute, not from fear, but anticipation. Then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw him. Asher. He stood at a distance near the vending machines, dressed in dark gray, phone in hand, pretending to scroll, but watching me. He wasn't done, and neither was I. I stood up from the bench near Gate C3, every nerve in my body lit. He hadn't approached, just watched, like a coward, like a man who used to be my brother. But the moment was gone. The next was already unfolding. I spotted them before they saw me. My parents sat near a wall of windows, dwarfed by their coats and the rush of travelers pushing past. My mother looked small, shoulders hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, despite the terminal's artificial warmth. My father's old travel coat, the navy one with worn elbows, was draped across her back. Her hands trembled, curled loosely in her lap. I started walking toward them, slowly, cautiously, not knowing what kind of welcome I was about to get. My mother lifted her head as I approached, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she said it. "Your brother told us we shouldn't see you anymore." I stopped dead in my tracks. The crowd moved around me in a blur. That sentence, the weight of it, landed sharper than anything I'd been bracing for. Not a question, not confusion, just a decision. "What?" I asked, breath barely escaping. She looked away, eyes tracing the gray floor tiles. "He said it's for the best." I felt the room tilt slightly, not because I was surprised, but because I still, stupidly, hoped. They didn't come here to hear me out. They came here to deliver his message. I knelt down in front of them, slow, deliberate, my knees touching the cold floor. "He used you," I said, quiet enough that only they could hear. "He wanted me to see what he could take. And you—" I looked at her trembling fingers. "You let him." Her eyes welled, but she didn't look at me. "He said you changed." "I did," I whispered. I stopped being quiet. The silence hung like fog. Then behind me I felt it. Presence, not touch. I turned and there he was. Asher. He stepped into view just outside the terminal doors, where the wind slid in through each opening. His expression was calm, mouth drawn in that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. Arrogant, dismissive. "I told them to stay out of it," he said like we were discussing weekend plans. "You've made enough messes." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the phone, tapped once. "You want to hear what you sound like when you lie?" I pressed play. His voice, crystal clear and unmistakably his. I had her sign it while Dad was in the hospital. She was too emotional to notice. The sound sliced through the chaos around us. A few heads turned. Asher stepped back. "You wouldn't—" "I already did. It's uploaded," I said, my voice even. "If anything happens to me, it goes everywhere." He stared at me, jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscle twitch near his temple. Behind me, I felt my mother stiffen. I turned slightly to see her face, pale, shaken. "Is that true?" she asked Asher. Her voice cracked, thin as tissue, barely audible over the terminal announcements. He didn't answer at first, just stared at me like he wished he could turn me back into the girl who didn't speak up. Then, "You think she didn't try to take over the business while Dad was dying?" That was it. That was all he had. I took a step toward him. "I used my hands to build what you stole, while you were busy lining up your next betrayal." For once, he didn't have a comeback, and just behind us, unbeknownst to any of us, a young journalist from a local station was filming a travel segment. Her camera turned toward the raised voices. The recording caught the entire exchange. By nightfall, the clip would be viral. Family business scandal unfolds at Denver airport. I hadn't planned it, but the universe has a sense of timing. Asher didn't say another word. He turned and walked off, swallowed by the crowd, smaller than he'd ever looked. I turned back to my parents. My mother was crying, quietly, her face buried behind shaking hands. She whispered something, a confession meant for no one. "He was supposed to protect you both." I lowered myself again, this time beside her. "No," I said. "He protected himself. I just stopped protecting the lie." I reached for my father's coat and gently wrapped it tighter around her shoulders. She didn't resist. And then, almost without thinking, I pulled the handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the tears from her cheek. The same one I used to clean my father's desk. The same one I folded every day to remind myself why I kept going. Everything had come full circle. I didn't win. I just stopped losing. The days that followed felt like exhaling after holding my breath too long. It wasn't relief, not exactly, more like space. A strange, still kind of space where things weren't okay, but they were no longer collapsing. Morning light cut through the slats of my blinds, casting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, untouched. I sat at the window, listening to the hum of traffic outside, letting the quiet settle deep in my bones. The handkerchief sat folded beside me, clean, unused. I'd seen the airport video more times than I cared to admit in the first 2 days. News anchors, online reaction videos, endless captions. Family implosion caught live. Then I turned it off. All of it. The world could debate it all they wanted. I wasn't looking for applause. I just needed it to stop hurting. A few board members had sent cautious emails, support wrapped in disclaimers, polite approval carefully worded. One even said, "Brave move, Marin. Let's catch up when things cool down." People love justice until it costs them something, like their social calendar. I didn't reply to any of them. When the call from my mother came 3 days later, I nearly let it ring out. But curiosity won. Her voice was softer than I remembered. No anger, just worn down. "He's leaving town for a while," she said. "Good. I wish it hadn't come to this." "It always was going to," I said, not cruelly, just honest. There was a long pause, not heavy, not hostile, just quiet. Then she said goodbye. I didn't hang up until she did. Later that week, I went back to my father's old workshop. The place hadn't changed much. Dust hung in the beams of afternoon sun like ghosts. Blueprints rolled in corners, rulers left askew. I sat at the desk and unrolled a faded sheet labeled Veil Foundation. For future builders. My father's handwriting curved carefully across the top. I traced it with my fingers. That day, I decided not to reopen Vale Construction, not the way it had been. Instead, I filed for a new name, a small firm focused on training young women in design and construction. Girls like I used to be, unseen, unheard, but not anymore. I wouldn't build just to build. I'd build to give them something I had to fight so hard for, a voice. The handkerchief, once carried like armor, now hung behind my new desk, framed in glass. Not a keepsake, a reminder. Silence isn't weakness, not when you learn to break it with purpose. Months passed, slowly, steadily. The noise faded. The firestorms in the media died down. People moved on, as they always do. Then one Thursday afternoon, she came. I heard the knock and opened the door to find my mother standing there, holding a bakery bag and 2 cups of coffee, like we hadn't gone months without seeing each other. Her hands shook a little, but her eyes met mine. "I thought maybe we could just sit," she said. "No talking, just coffee." I stepped aside. The air between us felt cautious at first, like walking barefoot on unfamiliar ground, but it warmed. We sat at the kitchen table, the smell of cinnamon drifting between us. She sipped her drink before finally saying, "I should have believed you. I was afraid of losing both of you." I didn't say anything right away. Then, "We already lost each other for a while." She looked down, nodded slowly. "But we can build again," I added. Slower this time. The silence that followed wasn't painful. It was soft. It understood. Weeks later, I drove past the airport again. Same terminal, same cold steel benches by the entrance. Except now they were filled with strangers, whose stories I'd never know. No ghosts lingered there anymore. I parked for a moment, rolled down the window, and let the wind touch my face. Then I pulled out my phone and typed a message I'd never send. "You were right, Asher. Power doesn't last, but dignity does." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without regret. As I pulled back onto the road, the sun stretched long and gold across the sky. There wasn't music playing, no movie-ending moment, just a steady hum of tires and the sound of my own breath. Some stories don't end in victory or defeat, just peace. And after everything, peace is loud enough,